Christopher Hitchens, we start off this program on a new Monday and a new week with a fax from Bethany Beach, Delaware. Dear C-SPAN, I dearly look forward to the Brothers Hitchens Monday morning. What a show that will be. Let's hope we don't disappoint. Well, Peter, it says, though I do think Christopher is on the side of the angels. I fear that Peter has a bigger mouth. Peter seems to know the devil and the details, so I think he can win an argument even when he is wrong as hell.
Well, I'm never wrong, of course, so I wouldn't know about that. But, of course, Christopher's on the side of a certain type of angel. The good old left-wing angels, of whom there seem to be a great deal here. But I like to think I'm on the side of the other lot.
Let me start by asking about Bosnia. Do you disagree on Bosnia? I should hope so. I've become a bit of a bore and a fanatic about Bosnia over the last couple of years, especially since going to Sarajevo the summer before last. And I still believe that it's a genocide in progress, and that the nerve of outrage about this appears to have gone dead in this country, especially in and around the presidency, which is the only place where a proper response could have come. Peter Hitchens, what about you?
Well, I think it's the most amazing effect of television on modern society that we're now discussing sending troops and airplanes to bomb a city, to bomb the surroundings of a city and a country, to make ourselves feel happy about watching the evening news, so that we can feel more relaxed about the atrocities which are served up nightly as a way, I think, of increasing television viewership. There is no policy in this. It's purely a matter of looking at Bosnia, saying it's horrible, and then mouthing the wonderful old phrase, something must be done.
That's a good illustration of the difference between us, I would say. I think, in fact, that the press on this occasion has done its job. I mean, I had begun after the Gulf War to despair of the press because it was becoming a megaphone for the government. And in this case, I think that a handful of journalists and correspondents have actually kept the Bosnian story and issue alive, and a good thing too. I'd instance particularly John Burns of the New York Times, and Roy Gutman of Newsday, who did wonderful reporting from inside the Serbian camps and from the city of Sarajevo itself, and have restored sort of my pride in the good old profession. What do you think is going to happen?
I fear very much that it will come to airstrikes, and that after airstrikes, ground troops, and after ground troops, another long misery, solving nothing, costing a great deal of lives, and probably not ending in our lifetimes. But there is obviously always the possibility it won't this time happen, but as long as the pressure is on, there is always the danger that we will find ourselves with military intervention.
But don't you love it when the right wing suddenly turns pacifist? I mean, they all talk as if they're all doves these days when it comes to Bosnia, because they don't have any, what they call vital interests there. There's no oil there. There's no imperial question at stake, so the hell with it. All the rest of the time, I mean, people like myself who have had their doubts in the past about military intervention or the use of force have been arraigned by this stage as sort of faggots and appeasers and generally, you know, unsolid citizens. I mean, I really find the outbreak of establishment pacifism in and around the Pentagon to be one of the most cynical things I've ever seen. Look, if they're not going to do this, if they're not going to do anything to stop the third attempt this century to physically destroy a European minority, then I think there's a very good case indeed for abolishing the defense budget, but which I'd be happy to see. But if they're going to insist on keeping this kind of level of readiness and expenditure, it's obscene to be overflying Sarajevo every day as we do with tremendous technology, simply to watch below the slaughter and execution.
I think it was the historian A.J.P. Taylor who said that in this century idealists have killed millions more people than cynics by their belief that they can solve things, and I fear this may be another instance of that.
Which one of you is the older?
I'm fractionally older.
How much?
I wish you'd guessed, actually. I should have invited you to guess. Well, I'll be 45 in April. I'm feeling every millisecond of it at the moment. Oh, and I'll be 43 in October.
Golly. What was it like growing up together?
Combative.
Combative? Did you disagree at an early age?
Yes, I think one could say that. About the big things and the little things.
What big things did you disagree?
I don't think I was probably a very good person to have as an older brother. I shouldn't think I was much fun. In the give and the take bit, I was always rather, you know, inclined to think I was right.
You've been over in this country for the last 6 months.
Yes.
how does Great Britain look to you from this country?
Well, I'm still recovering from the way it looked from Moscow, and I'm afraid at the moment it looks in a very sad case. A country which, when you return from the Soviet Union as it then was to most Western countries, you feel a sense of a weight lifting from your shoulders, a sense of colour, activity and life. But when I came back to Britain, I found that there were rather a lot of alarming echoes of the sloth and decay that I'd found in Moscow, that I felt far more than I had before, that it was a country in decay. And when I come over here and see a country which many British people look down on as a festering place of crime and violence, and find that how immensely civilized it is in fact, again, it's a slap in the face to any smug conceptions of what Britain is like.
There's a whole page devoted in Newsweek to the following story: Getting the Kinks Out, Britain, Sex Scandals, Tar, Major's Government. And it leads off by saying Stephen Milligan was a rising star in the British Conservative Party, a former journalist who spent only 2 years in Parliament. He was already in line for a ministerial job. Still a bachelor at 45, he had dated a string of beautiful women, but apparently something was missing in Milligan's life. He fretted about loneliness and all-consuming demands of politics. He paid $1,000 to join a dating service called Drawing Down the Moon. And last week, his secretary found him dead on a kitchen table in his London home. A plastic bag over his head, electrical cord coiled loosely up his body from his ankle to his neck. Otherwise, he was naked except for a garter belt and women's stockings. There was no sign of murder or suicide. Evidently, Milligan died when a kinky sex stunt went horribly wrong. What is going on? There are other sex scandals in this story.
Milligan was a friend of mine. We were exact contemporaries at university. In fact, he expelled me from the Oxford Union, of which he was then president, because I broke up a debate in the course of the Vietnam War when our terrible foreign secretary came to defend the invasion of Cambodia. And I kept up with him on, journalistic and political basis for a while. It's not true, by the way, about the string of beautiful women. I don't want to say anything against him now that he's dead, but his whole problem was that he was unlucky with the fair sex. It's a sort of, I don't want to say anything cheap, but it's a kind of revenge on John Major's very second-rate policy announced at his last party conference of proclaiming family values and back to the basics. As everyone who's followed this kind of politics knows, as soon as you start doing that, everyone is found in the men's room. I mean, it's the same when Jimmy Swaggart starts calling down hellfire on sinners. You can pretty much set your watch. You know the next thing is going to happen to Jimmy Swaggart. And I think it's it can't be coincidence that the pressure of this kind of public hypocrisy is too much for some of its practitioners.
It also goes on in this piece to say on January the 5th, Tim Yeo, is that the way you pronounce it?
Yo.
Tim,
as in yo-ho-ho.
Not, it was close. A junior environment minister was forced to resign after admitting he had fathered an illegitimate child, his second, as it turned out. Next, the Earl, I'm sure I'll mispronounce this, Caithness?
Caithness.
Caithness. The Minister for Aviation and Shipping resigned after his wife committed suicide. She was said to be distraught over their failing marriage and his affair with another woman.
And there's another one this morning in the New York Times.
There's then Tory MP David Ashby denied his wife's charges that he was a homosexual. He had shared a bed with another man while on vacation in France. These are Tories. What's going on?
Well, if the Kinsey report is true, which I think probably isn't, but even if any of these statistics have any relevance at all, there are 650 people in the House of Commons, and some of them are going to have some fairly peculiar proclivities, and some of them are going to commit adultery. And frankly, so what? If a government says that it wants to encourage people back to basics, as John Major puts it, to make people behave better, then of course you will find embarrassing instances of people not behaving well. It doesn't undermine the value of the policy. It doesn't undermine the damage. It doesn't undermine the fact that huge damage is being done to modern societies by divorce, illegitimacy, and the things which follow from it. It doesn't mean they don't have the right to say, look, we want to do something about this, just because a few members of Parliament are found in flagrante delicto, or indeed lying on the kitchen table in garter belt.
This is your paper, and it can be bought here in the United States?
Yes, it can.
Inside, there's a big spread, My Regrets by Ashdown's Lover. Patty Ashdown's Lover, I guess this is a 2-year-old story that's known, and that she first, this is the first time she's ever talked?
I think it's the first time this one has, yes.
Patty Ashdown, head of the Liberal Party. What do you, is there, do the Brits look at this kind of a story differently than the Americans?
Very slightly. I think perhaps a little more cynically than Americans do. What I used to notice when I covered politics in England, which I haven't done for a long time, was that an old rule of thumb seemed to hold true. With the Tories, it was always sex, and with Labour people, it was almost always money, taking bribes or getting involved in corrupt business practices. I don't know if that's still true. I haven't covered it for a while, but in both cases, it seemed to me at least potentially ironic in that the Tories tended to go on more about family values and Labour tended to go on more about the evils of capitalism, and they were all caught in the hypocrisies of, or rather both caught, in the respective hypocrisies of their two positions. Beyond that, I mean, I don't want to agree with Peter any more than I have to, but I mean, it's obviously true. You can't have politicians without this, because they're all made of the same clay. Nor can you have, I suppose, the sort of full-time dedication to ambition and self-advancement that was demanded of someone like Stephen Milligan, for example, without quite a lot of loneliness and misery.
Explain something. Over the weekend, I think it was on Friday, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which met here in Washington that we carried, had a news conference with a woman by the name of Paula Jones, who alleged an involvement or an incident with the President of the United States. And this ended up on the front page of Saturday's Washington Times.
Yes. She spent 20 minutes rebuffing his advances, apparently.
And it says, woman accuses Clinton of sexual advances in 1991. This is the front page of the Washington Times. The story was covered in the Washington Post, but it was buried in this morning's front page style section piece on the Conservative Political Action Conference.
I wondered where it had got to. I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I'll show you where it was in just a moment. It's in this story on the front page of the style here, and we can talk about this. But why the difference from your both of your perspectives from different newspapers, and why would something like that have gotten more publicity in Great Britain in your paper?
Well, it did. It was carried quite prominently in my paper on Saturday morning. It's always amusing to see how much longer it takes the Washington Post and the New York Times to deal with these things. We had the story of the troopers' allegations against the president in the Daily Express the morning after they appeared on CNN. It took the American press about 36 hours longer to respond to them. I think it's partly because of an old British tradition of being licentious in public and prudish in private. We care more about sex. We find it more offensive for politicians to behave in this way than Americans. Americans are more interested in money. And I think the Whitewater affair has done far more damage to Mr. Clinton in the eyes of most Americans than the sex allegations, which are dismissed and actually not even known by many people.
I think that must be true with the proviso that some Americans suspect that the Whitewater affair, so to say, and the other allegations are in some sense connected. In other words, that the problem with Jennifer Flowers was not whether or not she slept with the president, but whether or not she got a job out of it. And indeed whether or not that's the reason she lost it. So I think as long as the two stories remain separated in the public mind, the president has a chance of getting away with both of them. But if they should converge, which I think it's the fear of the Washington Post, that they will, then the press will look stupid, because the press convinced itself earlier this year that it alone was responsible for the death of Vincent Foster and had hounded him, and has been apologizing and backpedaling from the story ever since. So there'd be a lot of climbing down to be done.
Here's a quote from the Conservative Political Action Conference in Lloyd Grove's piece in the Washington Post. I've never seen so much angst over a politician, mused GOP consultant Craig Shirley, who helped organize the 21st annual CPAC conference. Republican strategist David Keene, head of the American Conservative Union, CPAC's main sponsor, acknowledged that despite everything, public opinion polls still show the president enjoying healthy job approval. I think people, that is, conservative activists, are a little perplexed with all the things that have come out in recent months about Bill Clinton, Keene remarked.
This is another illustration of why America needs monarchy. You have to have a schizophrenia when you deal with the president here. First of all, there is this man who represents the Constitution, the laws of the nation, who represents America, who stands up at the State of the Union speech and looks actually quite like Ronald Reagan, who can say, "Oh, shucks," with the best of them. And then you have the man who is twisting people's arms behind their backs to get them to vote the right way, the man who has made the most astonishing promises to get elected. And he's the same person. And Americans have to think of a basic, down-in-the-mud politician as a monarch for 8 years. And they prefer very much the monarch to the politician. But in the end, the contradiction can sometimes prove too much.
I don't see anyone who's worked in Fleet Street as long as Peter has can possibly be recommending a monarchy to anyone, even the English. If you want to distract people's attention from the tedium of existence and the utter futility of life and the vulgarity of politics, the best way to do it is not to have the House of Windsor. As to why the right wing are worried about Clinton, I quite see why they're so worried. I mean, he's basically nicked their entire wardrobe. This administration, in practically every important respect, is what the Bush-Quayle administration would have been. Very often, most often, in fact, with the same personnel. Clearly, this puts the Conservatives, the extreme right, actually, in a position of potential opportunity, because they didn't like Bush-Quayle all that much either, or certainly didn't like the Bush bit of it. But for the moment, it's very troubling for GOP circles in general. To see David Gergen defending this must be ironic for them, and to see Alan Greenspan and all of their head honchos from the last time effectively occupying the most public important jobs and the most private important ones.
By the way, we've gotten some other faxes directly related to your two's appearance here. From Phil Crossland of Youngstown, Ohio, how would your guests assess the state of the Anglo-American relationship today, particularly after the royal treatment our news people and talk show hosts gave that Irish terrorist or patriot, depending on your point of view, and the British reluctance to back airstrikes in Bosnia?
Well, given that I think that probably the natural state of our two countries is one of conflict, I think the relationship is very good. We have here an extremely effective embassy with contacts at the highest levels in very important areas, such as intelligence. We have an enormous amount of investment here. We can understand each other better than most. But underlying our relations is a deep division over how the world should be arranged. We came here in 1814 and burned down the White House to make this point, and since then, for the most part, relations have been touchy. And everybody seems to forget that before Churchill came here in Christmas 1941, right up to that point, things were pretty bad. And what friendship we have was forged by Roosevelt and Churchill, and we have built upon it and made the most of it ever since. And as Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Secretary, says, it helps us to punch above our weight in the world to have built in a friendship with the United States. The Adams incident didn't help, but I don't think it damaged the fundamental goodwill that still exists here.
Here's what, this is the issue that's still good until tomorrow when the new one comes out, the International Express.
Yeah.
And this is Jerry Adams. Inside, by the way, there's a headline that says, "I had to challenge this man's glib lies," and there's a picture of your brother. And it says, "It was left to the Daily Express to let millions of Americans know the true colors of Jerry Adams. Our Washington correspondent, Peter Hitchens, exposed the Sinn Féin leader, his glib lies and phony claims as a man of peace in a blistering TV showdown with former New York Mayor Edward Koch on the Fox Network's show Street Talk." Do you agree with, what do you think on the...
I mean, I have to repress the thrill of pride that there's some such a pugnacious member of my family and someone who's prepared to go against the stream and be a John Bull and all that, but I think that the British position on Ireland can't be defended. I think the injury of partition done to the Irish people is a terrible one and is the root cause of the present discontent. I think that the Sinn Féin voice has a perfect right to be heard, and I think it was perfectly ridiculous for the British government to attempt to ban Mr. Adams on making a visit here, or indeed from being heard on the networks in England. And this is the revenge for the stupidity of that policy.
You've been here too long. You fall into exactly the same trap that a lot of American commentators fell into in imagining this as an issue of free speech. The reason why Jerry Adams was banned from this country was because the administration understood that he was connected at the highest level with terrorism. And I believe it's the case that people who are connected with terrorism are not allowed into the United States. Suddenly,
I wish it was true.
Suddenly the president reversed that policy. And it was never a matter of free speech. It was a matter, straightforwardly, of terrorism and American policy towards it. We were only asking this country to implement its own policy.
What would happen in our newspapers here, let's say the Washington Post, if this same kind of a picture and headline of David Broder saying, "I had to challenge this man's glib lies." I mean, what would you've been on this program before, what would be the reaction out there?
If David Broder talked more like that, I, for one, would be delighted. But there is a refreshing thing about Fleet Street, even really terrible papers like the Daily Express, of which my brother toils. I mean, Tory rags of the vilest dye and hue are not hypocritical. They don't say, please read the Daily Express for your objective view of today's events, strictly neutral, indifferent, even-handed and so forth. They tell you where they're coming from. And as a result, the Fleet Street tradition of prose is a good deal more robust than the sort of pretend ideology of objectivity with which we get the consensus served up to us here.
Do either one of you, I saw this over the weekend, I wanted to ask both of you about this. Here's a picture of President Clinton. This is over the weekend, his radio address, and it's President Lincoln's.
Look first upon this picture and on this. Hyperion to Asata.
185th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And then, I don't know if it's fair to call him President Clinton's nemesis, but Paul Greenberg, who writes from Little Rock, also invokes the same man, Abraham Lincoln. And at the end of this piece on Abraham Lincoln that was published over the weekend, I'm going to drop it so I can read it. His last paragraph is, "Power is now in the hands of the pros, and all is supposed to be right in the world. At so assuring a time, why pause to dwell on this rough figure behind the now burnished myth? Perhaps because it is inescapably as danger recurs and history continues, Americans may yet need of certain qualities that, for want of any better word, might be called Lincoln-esque." Do you all follow Abraham Lincoln?
Oh, sure.
Well, yes.
What's he mean to people that weren't raised here?
Extraordinary combination of saint, martyr, and politician, which doesn't crop up more than about once every 5 centuries. A very great piece of good fortune for the United States that he was both a man who was essentially good with good objectives and a man who was capable of fighting the battles of politics with the necessary cynicism and brutality when it was called for.
Do you see anything Lincoln-esque about Bill Clinton, for instance?
I can't rightly say as how I do, no. I think of Gore Vidal's novels of Washington, his cycle of historical novels. His Lincoln is the finest portrait because it does show someone who, after all, on many ethical questions, was assumed by the Confederacy to be, in a sense, one of them, or at least someone who could possibly be recuperated. And they consistently underestimated him. They thought, after all, he's basically with us on the issue of slavery, and he's basically with us on the issue of territorial expansion. They didn't get him at all. They didn't realize there was a point beyond which he could not be pushed. And I think there's an analogy in my mind between that and the way that some of the European fascist leadership thought of Churchill. They thought, well, he's right-wing, he's anti-communist, surely we can make a deal with him. They didn't really get the point till it was too late.
You're going to believe this. I did not. This fax came in after I showed this last thing, but it says, "Chris, why don't you reform the Lincoln Brigade and go seek justice in the Balkan Civil War? I'll pay your airfare over." Doug Henry of Haverhill, New Hampshire.
Perhaps I should explain what the Lincoln Brigade is for those who, or was, rather. Well, no, it still is, because many of its old comrades still muster for annual meetings. It was the detachment of American volunteers that went to fight on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. It was the first American force in the field to be commanded by an African-American, in fact, called Oliver Law, who I believe was killed at the Battle of Jarama. And it became the object of McCarthyite persecution in the 40s and 50s. And it was on the list of banned organizations of the Attorney General for a while. It was closely associated with the Communist Party for a bit. And it, I think, showed some breadth of mind of such people to take Honest Abe as their mentor and flag for the fight.
Peter Hitchens.
And yes, I wished, frankly, I mean, this will sound absurd coming from a pudgy person in his mid-40s such as myself, but I very much admire those who have gone to volunteer their services in Bosnia, of whom there are some thousands now, and I wish there were more of them, and I wish I had the nerve to do it myself.
Peter Hitchens, another fax just came in from Mark Finkelstein of Ithaca, New York. On Bosnia, does Christopher Hitchens find it amusing or disturbing to be on the same side as Margaret Thatcher?
Well, you better ask him.
What do you think? We just had Lady Thatcher here in this country for a birthday celebration of Ronald Reagan. What do you think of her at this point?
Well, it was a moment of nostalgia to see them there and to remember how things were. But it reminded me it reminded me a bit of a problem which grows for me as I spend more time abroad reporting, that many of us use foreign countries as a playground for our consciences. I was guilty of doing this in what we rightly called the evil empire, when it still existed. I believed that there were simple solutions to the problems. Liberal and left-wing people were guilty of doing it in South Africa, and have yet to see the consequences of what they willed, but when they do, will not be as pleased as they had hoped they would be. And in Yugoslavia, again, we are finding a country becoming a playground for consciences, and I feel that Mrs. Thatcher has come to see it as a place where she has to show her old spirit of directness, toughness, refusal to give in to dictators, but she's mistaken it. She's mistaken it for something completely different from what it actually is.
Well, I always think it's a shame that Thatcher and Reagan get mentioned in the same breath, because though I was a political opponent of both, I still am. I mean, I think that in point of character and bearing, she's worth 10 of him at any time. And I have to say that though I'm delighted that, for example, people like
that much of the time.
No, I was sort of an admirer of the old battle axe, a grudging admirer, I must say, but in point of fortitude, there's something to admire. Yeah,
she's a member of the House of Lords. You normally call
the Baroness, to be sure. And yes, I think it's good that she's held up the West, for want of a better word, to the humiliation it's inflicting upon itself in its complicity in the mass murder in Bosnia. Yeah.
Paul, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ivaska of Las Vegas writes, Christopher Hitchens is one of my favorite authors. I'm enjoying For the Sake of Argument. Another excellent book, notes, he says, though I have to keep my trusty dictionary at the ready. How'd that book sell?
Thanks to you. I shouldn't be so unctuous as to flatter you on your own show, but Book Notes is a very well-watched program, I discover. I got a huge mail back from it. A lot of very interesting phone calls, letters, faxes, and my publishers tell me that it's why the book was reprinted. It is, by the way, still in fine bookstores everywhere.
For the Sake of Argument is the name of it, and I'll ask Peter Hitchens to react to this. My question is as follows. Though individual reporters may be slightly left of center, it seems the major media are functionally quite right-wing because of corporate greed and cross-ownership. Do the Hitchens brothers agree, and could they contrast the situation with that in Great Britain?
Well, no, I don't agree at all. One of the most striking things here is that the only political opinion available in the grand newspapers and the major TV networks is the political opinion of the Guardian newspaper in Britain, which is but one of 9, I think, national newspapers, most of which in Britain are quite well to the right of standard opinion in the United States.
To the contrary, I mean, there is, for example, no one with my political opinions has a regular column in an American newspaper. Since the question was phrased personally speaking, the Guardian would be nearer to my own political opinions. There's no reflection of that in the American press. The American press, I think, is probably in its staffing predominantly liberal, but its political outlook is conditioned by the search for consensus, which is a conservative impulse.
We're going to grab a phone call in about 30 seconds. What's the differences in your lives so far? I mean, you were born in Malta and you were born in Portsmouth, England?
Yes, we were both born in different bits of the then contracting but still existent British Empire. Portsmouth being its main naval base. Our father was a naval officer, and Malta being then one of its semi-colonies in the Mediterranean. And we diverged. Well, I left the United Kingdom in the early 80s, and Peter went to Moscow not long after that. So we haven't actually seen each other for about 10 years.
What's it like being here together? You spend much time together here?
No, but we bump into one. It's quite a big city.
Are you married?
Yes.
Children?
Yes.
Are they here?
Yes.
How many?
2.
We know Mr. Hitchens is married. How many kids?
By my second wife, I have just had a lovely daughter called Laura Antonia Blue Hitchens. And by my first wife, I have 2 children, Alexander and Sophia. Alexander was once on this show for 2 seconds, endorsing Governor Brown's campaign for the presidency. Speaking
of Governor Brown, he's back on the radio, and we'll have a simulcast of his program tomorrow night, Tuesday night, 7 o'clock East Coast time until 9 out of Oakland, California. 2 hours of Jerry Brown. Those of you who followed him or didn't might be interested in tuning in. First call for our 2 guests. New Orleans, Louisiana. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to comment about John Major's Back to Basics policy and also about Peter Hitchens' suggestion that this country needs a monarch. I think that the Back to Basics policy, as most of the family values programs here in this country, are very discriminatory and very homophobic. And I think that Peter Hitchens' suggestion that we need a monarch here is ludicrous. There's no way that a monarch could represent the diversity of this country. And I was totally opposed to George Bush and Ronald Reagan accepting titles of knighthood or some such nonsense from England. I think that shows they have a very poor understanding of the history of the opposition between this country and Great Britain.
Thanks.
Well, perhaps you should have your own knighthoods, then people wouldn't need to go abroad to get them. And as for the other things that you say, I've never quite understood what this word homophobic means. It translates as meaning fear of man. But the point about back to basics is illustrated actually by some figures produced by William Bennett, which I happen to have brought with me, what he called the Condition of Society Index. In this country, the number of violent crimes between 1960 and 1992 rose from 288,000 to 1,932,000. The average prison sentence has gone down from 22 days to 8. The number of illegitimate births from 5.3% to 29.5%. There are some basic changes in our societies at the moment, in Britain and America, and those basic changes seem to have brought a great decline in the quality of people's lives. So if anybody anywhere says that we need to go back to basics, then I for one am prepared to listen, even if that person is found with a mistress the following day. I still think he has the right to say it, because it's a very important point about us, our society, and it's not being made.
Madison Heights, Michigan. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to say Christopher is a very good professional journalist, and I like listening to his commentary.
Thank you.
My question is, do you think that there's going to be a Republican platform that's comparable to Clinton's? Now that he's stolen majority of the issues, do you think that they'll stop pointing the finger and come up with some issues? What do you predict for the conservatives?
Well, they're in the throes of it at the moment, as you saw if you watched any of their proceedings over the weekend. I think the temptation will be to go for something like the William Bennett agenda, what's sometimes called the social issues, and to bang the drum about public morality. It usually does work because, as Peter has just shown, there are always people prepared to listen when you say the country's going to the dogs, children don't respect their parents anymore, pretty soon, dogs will be throwing buckets of water over us in the street and so forth. And we'll all be frightening the horses. That seems to work, but I think it's usually a good starter and a bad finisher as a political issue, partly because it is, of course, self-satirizing.
Christopher Hitchens has a piece in Vanity Fair this month about Oliver North as we take this call from Salt Lake City, Utah.
Good morning. I wanted to ask Peter about the schools in England. Do they discriminate against Christian students or the Bible or prayer? And also, do you have homosexuals attacking churches over there as they do here in the United States?
Thanks.
Well, I don't think there's much much of a homosexual offence against the Church. My experience of the Church of England is that there's an awful lot of them in it. But the schools are in the most appalling mess, and it's not just because of religion. Officially, there is supposed to be some kind of religion in schools. There's no separation of church and state. But the teachers and the education authorities and the education bureaucracy have done everything they can in the past 30 years to remove any kind of moral content from education, and they've pretty much succeeded.
Judy Robinson of Hyattsville, Maryland. We'll throw these faxes in from time to time. She says, I am ashamed to be an American and to pass this nation on to my children. I am watching politicians like Congressman Rostenkowski thwart the judicial system. The President of the United States hide evidence into corruption probes, and Chairman, she says Chairman Foley, she means Speaker Foley, through court action, deny the rights of the voters of Washington State to limit his terms.
Oh, it seems to me so obvious that the term limitation would be an affront to the Constitution. The Constitution states the disabilities that prevent you or may prevent you from being elected or being put forward for election. These do not include having been elected before. And I don't see any reason why they should. It's a completely false solution to what is admittedly a real problem of the domination by people of long tenure of the big committees. I'll give you just one instance. Henry Gonzalez of Texas, who is actually the scourge of corruption in Congress, and was the man who uncovered the ramifications of the savings and loan scandal in Congress, for example. and is now, I'm very glad to say, finally chair of the House Banking Committee, and is going to mount an attack on the fastness and secrecy of the Federal Reserve, has been re-elected in his district for, I forget now how many Congresses, but a very large number. It would be a tragedy if people of his caliber and experience were removed by this non sequitur of term limitation.
Before Judy Robinson has a fit out there, let me get the balance in this, because she, hold on, Peter Hitchens, just a second. She says, I'm ashamed to be an American. She listed the Democratic concerns, and she says, on the Republican side, I have witnessed Watergate, Iran-Contra, the SNL scandals, the Keating Five, and Senator Packwood protected by a system of power and founding fathers never intended.
Most of the Keating Five are Democrats, of course.
Well, I'm not here to speak for the Republican Party.
But what about the whole? But what about her whole view is that she doesn't want to pass this nation on to her children because she views the whole system as corrupt?
Well, it's hopeless to expect a political system to throw up people who are all entirely clean. You will find within it large numbers of people who are not. But that doesn't mean you should despair about the system. The fact remains it's immensely preferable to the dictatorial systems which are the alternative. And just try living for 2 years in the evil empire and you'll know what I mean.
Indianapolis, for the Hitchens brothers. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for book notes. I just had my history lesson and economics and everything this morning.
Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I especially am a fan of Christopher Hitchens. He makes me think in things that I had never thought about before. I'm always glad to hear his opinion, whether I agree wholeheartedly with it or not, but I'm usually on his side. So keep up the good work, please.
Thank you. I'll try my best.
Are there any more Hitchens like you guys? I can't imagine any more rivalry.
Not of this vintage, no.
Okay.
Are there other brothers and sisters?
No.
I really have a question that I would like specifically Christopher Hitchens' response to. It may be kind of off the wall, but I know that Hong Kong is getting ready to revert to the Chinese, and I wonder what you might have to say about that.
Thanks. Thanks for the call.
Yeah, I mean, in 1997, I believe it is, and a date that's become a sort of hieroglyphic in the minds of people in Hong Kong. Quite correctly, in one way, the lease reverts to mainland China, from which Hong Kong was annexed and detached. And that's a treaty and should be, I think, honored. But the fact is that since it was annexed or detached, Hong Kong has generated its own population and culture. And though it hasn't been a democracy, it's been a British colony with actually almost no democratic precept at all. It's been in many respects an open society. And the fear is that it will be handed back to the senile dictators in Beijing without any guarantees, any real guarantees for the political or economic freedom or the freedom to travel and leave of its inhabitants. And that this, one of Mrs. Thatcher's most signal failures of nerve, given the reputation she had for standing up to foreign dictators, was her apparent willingness to roll over and trade Hong Kong for British business concessions in mainland China. Under the present governor, Christopher Patten, who I used slightly to know, there's been an attempt to say to the Chinese that, look, we will insist on certain minimal democratic guarantees for the people of Hong Kong. Well, I don't think this is being pressed very strongly by the current major government. And I think it's a pity, because I think Hong Kong could be a germinal force in the rest of China for opening the society up and for inaugurating a democracy movement.
Isn't it wonderful, after 60 years and more of anti-colonialism, that everyone is now busy regretting the departure of the British from one of their supposedly oppressed colonies and fearing the arrival of one of the much lauded regimes which we were told were the banner of progress for so long? Doesn't it tell you something about what a mistake so much of that anti-colonialism was? And doesn't it make the point that as you look around the world at so many of the places where Britain used to rule, the result of Britain's departure has been a decline in practically every standard you care to name?
No, Hong Kong, for heaven's sake, was imposed on the Chinese as part of the base to conduct the Opium War. To force the Chinese to take opium into Britain.
It was, as you rightly say, it is a place where freedom exists, and where freedom will almost certainly cease to exist after July 1997. And if we were to believe the anti-colonialist propaganda of the past 50 or 60 years, it would not be that way round. It's a paradox.
Who owns the Daily Express?
A company called United Newspapers.
Is this the Lord Beaverbrook?
No, Lord Beaverbrook departed long ago, and his family.
I know, but did he own it at one point?
Oh, he did, yes.
And this...
It's the model for the Daily Beast in Evelyn Waugh's novel about Fleet Street.
Inside this
Daily
paper...
Brute, actually.
Is it the Brute?
Yeah, the Beast was the male.
Inside this paper, it said that I got, the International Express says, save big, only $130 a year. when does this come, if you buy it, to America?
When I buy it at a little deli around the corner from me, so then it turns up on Tuesday. So
Is it printed in the United States?
Yes, it's printed all over the world now. But there is a printing operation here, and I do urge people to buy it.
Do you have any idea how many copies are sold outside of Great Britain?
The worldwide circulation, it was only founded, I think, about 2 years ago, is now 100,000 and rising.
Washington, D.C., you're next.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
I'd like to ask, if I could, the opinion of your two English journalists about why there continues to be such a double standard deployed in reference to the historical facts surrounding Abraham Lincoln. I have three brief points I'd like to make and see if they could tell us why they don't report on them. One is the fact that Abraham Lincoln came to power in Illinois as a segregationist. If you remember his Peoria speech, he whipped up fear in the people in the Midwest, telling them that blacks were going to be brought into Illinois. His Peoria speech said he wanted to preserve the Midwest for free white labor. The second point is, in Article 14 of the Illinois State Constitution, which was in effect during the war between the states, it prohibited black people from even entering Illinois. They could not immigrate to Illinois. Why is that not brought out? And the third point is the Homestead Act that Mr. Clinton was referring to talks about giving away 160 acres to European families as they moved west, but it completely forgets the fact that Lincoln ordered a genocide of the Native Americans, starting with Colonel Shiverton in Colorado, in order to steal the land from the Native Americans so that the federal government of the northern states could give away the 160 acres. How could someone that orders a genocide continually be held up as a good fella?
Thanks.
The answer to your last question is because history is a tragedy and not a melodrama. And it's not a morality play, in other words. And it would be impossible to estimate any historic figure as other than a thug if you evaluated them by the standards of their time. It's true, though, I don't want to whitewash Lincoln. It is certainly true that he ran more than once as a segregationist. It's certainly true that he was very reluctant to adopt the Emancipation Proclamation, didn't adopt it till it was very late, and said openly that if he could have preserved the Union without freeing a single slave, he would rather have done so and would have been happy to do so. And it's also true, I believe, though this is disputed, let's say at any rate there's good evidence to believe that he discussed the prospect of removing all African Americans from the United States and resettling them in slave colonies, probably to be founded in the American Isthmus, the Central American Isthmus, I mean to say. That's argued about, but I think there's good evidence that at any rate he rehearsed the idea. Everyone knows what happened to the American Indians, of course, but that's why he's a great historic figure, because he was able to turn on his own prejudices and his own upbringing and many of his own supporters and decide that not only should the Union be preserved, but it should be preserved having been cleansed of slavery. So, coming from where he did, if you see what I mean, that's a historic achievement.
Lisa Chilton of Memphis, Tennessee, faxes this to you, and both of you, but we'll give it to Peter Hitchens first. Why should Americans consider the opinions of the British on anything today when formulating policy actions in Europe? If Britain was truly capable of exercising leadership in the world, shouldn't it start in its own backyard? The quarter-century carnage in Ireland remains a brush fire, and now the Bosnian conflict has flared into an inferno. Can't European powers put out these neighborhood blazes?
Well, as to whether we can put out the blazes, I have a strong suspicion that nobody can, and she rightly points out that 25 years of very close engagement in Ireland has not produced a solution. And if that isn't a warning about intervention in Bosnia, I don't know what is. But the point about Britain and the reason why you should listen to us is that we are and remain your only reliable ally in Europe. And when it comes down to real conflict and problems, you cannot turn anywhere else for reliable support. Various presidents have tried to make friends, for instance, with Germany, but have found that when push came to shove, the Germans deserted them. And the common culture which we have, which enables us to speak to each other much more frankly than any other two countries in the world, means that that's likely to continue.
Las Vegas, go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to ask Peter Hitchens, did he feel the same way as he does about Jerry Adams with Nelson Mandela's visit a couple of years ago? After all, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. And does he see any contradiction in that?
No, absolutely not. Nelson Mandela was a leader of a disenfranchised people whereas Jerry Adams is the leader of a small terrorist faction which supports a crime family in a country where there is universal suffrage. There is no comparison between the two. Jerry Adams has supported people who resort to violence because he believes it will gain him an advantage within a democracy. He's poisoned and polluted a democracy. Nelson Mandela, whatever criticisms anyone may have of him, was fighting against a regime which sought to suppress him, suppress free speech, and was not, by any standards, a democracy.
Did you say that you thought Jerry Adams was coming back to this country?
I heard that he'd been invited to be the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in San Francisco. So we'll have to go through all this again. I mean, I think it's. I had a confrontation with Mr. Adams myself in New York when he was here, and I don't really dissent from anything that Peter says about him as a person or his organisation. I just think that it's important to remember that there is in Northern Ireland, and there is also in the United States, a community of people that believes itself to be the loser in the Irish Civil War and the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, and I think that these people have a historic right to make that case.
Duluth, Georgia, you're next.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
Brian, I wanted to make a couple of comments. The calls you get at times that C-SPAN doesn't show the conservative point of view should be very happy. That Conservative Political Action Committee from Washington was shown over and over on the weekend, and I never saw, Brian, and one of the two brothers commented, never saw such, this is in the United States, not England, such mean-spirited people in all my life. Issues are not the thing, but I saw language there that was degrading, disgusting, cynical about President Clinton. Everything was personalized. And I myself, even though I'm a Democrat, when Reagan was in and when Bush was in, even though I didn't like their policies, I never called them names. And when we got into the Gulf War, I stuck behind my president. I don't know what's going on with the conservative movement today. And another question I want to make to the other, and I forgot your first, Peter. This Paula Jones, this girl you mentioned, if you have an antagonist who's always on your back, he brought up the draft, this Cliff Jackson from Arkansas. Mm-hmm. He brought up the Arkansas troopers. He also brought up this Paula Jones. In other words, if you had an enemy of yours and kept bringing things up, just one person, there's got to be something wrong. And by the way, I saw Paula Jones on ABC, and she said, I was harassed in 1991, and at least he could apologize to me. Now, what kind, I mean, I don't know if you can follow my viewpoint. In other words, where do they get these people all of a sudden? And those troopers, by the way, were on NET, and I called up this Paul Wyrick, who's head of that station, and I asked the troopers, I said, were you ever involved in insurance fraud? And one brother says one trooper says, well, yes, I have bones in my neck, I broke my neck, and I couldn't get insurance, and you must know what that means, so I had to use his name to get it. Now, these undercuts everything. So I just want to know what your comment in general of what I just said. Thank you very much.
Well, the first point is this. There's nothing wrong with a bit of name-calling in politics. It keeps it alive. And in Britain, we have it institutionalized twice a week in Prime Minister's Question Time when the Prime Minister of the day is exposed to a howling zoo of hostile members of Parliament. And I think it's very healthy for the political system. And we don't, and this is another point that I make about the monarchy, we don't have to respect our politicians as you do, because we have a monarch whom we can and have to respect, and therefore we can take them a little less seriously. And as a result, this schizophrenia which affects American politics is not our problem. As to Mr. Cliff Jackson, well, I see your point. He does seem to be pursuing his old ex-friend pretty ruthlessly. But Mr. Clinton is President of the United States, and what Mr. Jackson is saying about him is that he has behaved in a disgraceful fashion, and he is saying it again and again and again until somebody listens. And one can hardly complain in a democracy if presidents are criticized.
Your piece on Ollie North and the Vanity Fair issue that's out, by the way, that has this cover of family values with the Trump family. I would ask you about what chances you give Ollie North of being senator in 1995 in this town.
Excuse me. The piece is about not just why he shouldn't be a senator, but why he can't possibly be one. And won't be. I don't think he'll really even get the nomination. I don't think that there are enough Republicans in the great state of Virginia, the home state of Mr. Jefferson, who can overlook what I've written about in the article, which is Oliver North's involvement in the drug trade, Oliver North's involvement in the taking of hostages and trading of kidnapped victims in Beirut, Oliver North's attempt to cover up his mental crack-up, his lying, his chicanery, his petty theft, his betrayal of his friends. It's just not good enough. It makes me feel sort of quite, you know, like in favor of conservative values. You can't have a character that shabby, and I think the Republicans of Virginia will conclude that relatively early on and spare their party the embarrassment of having him carry the GOP flag.
By the way, we mentioned that Jerry Brown will be on this network on Tuesday night. On Friday from noon to 3, the Rush Limbaugh Show, simulcast from New York. We go next to Orlando, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Oh, well, tell Rush I'm drinking my orange juice then. Fellas from England. One of the questions I'd like to ask is, you talked about President Clinton. Oh, I have another point after this, by the way. But you talked about President Clinton's favorable ratings. Would you two talk about the ratings before the last election in Britain when they thought that Labour was going to win by a landslide? That's how polls are. Clinton is not favored in America. The press favors him, but not the people. And the next point I'd like to make, when you talk about carnage in the United States and slaughter of the horrifying pictures in Sarajevo, that's because CNN showed you the carnage and slaughter. We were not privy to that information in Waco. We had to be 3 to 5 miles away with cameras. When they went in to get the bodies of these babies and children, we did not see that carnage, I guarantee you. Mrs. Reno would not be there, neither would Clinton, if they saw the carnage in Waco as we saw in Sarajevo.
All right, thank you. Peter Hitchens, you want to try
Well, I'm glad to see that the adulation of Janet Reno, which astonished me at the time, is beginning to fade away. And the Waco trial makes it clear that all was not exactly as it should have been. But as for the ratings, yes, I remember that general election very well, because I was following the Labour Party leader, Neil Kinnock, around. Some people thought that I was his Cliff Jackson at the time. And the polls were not telling the truth. But in this case, I suspect that President Clinton is getting a measure of support. I watched his State of the Union speech, and I felt that he had somehow achieved an empathy with the American people, a monarchical empathy, to raise the point again, which will, unless a serious scandal in the next couple of years, carry him through to a second term.
Facts from Nina Plank here in Washington. Chris Hitchens, we miss you at Harper's Magazine as Washington editor. How long have you been away?
It's nice of people to remember that. Until a year and a half ago, I was the Washington editor for Harper's, and I used to do a column called Capital Letter from here. And then I was wooed away by Vanity Fair to write the column which I do every month called Culture Elite, the one that I just plugged, is the one about Oliver North.
How often are you in The Nation?
And I'm in The Nation every other week, a column called Minority Report. You could try and catch that in this plank if you liked.
G.J. Romano of Grants Pass, Oregon. Any chance of driving that C-SPAN bus to Texas? We've been there. And stopping at the trial of the Davidians. I'm getting overloaded on the Harding-Kerrigan issue, and I sure would like some more information about 17 children under the age of 10 could be torched by our employees. Now, this is news. The bus is going to actually it's going to Cape Canaveral today. Sorry that we can't divert to Texas. Denver, you're next.
Yes, Brian. Sure like Mondays and Fridays with the reporters.
Thanks.
I have a question for Mr. Christopher Hitchens. I've watched him many times on different TV forums or talk whatever and so forth, and he speaks beautifully, and he has a very fine mind.
Oh,
I just wonder if there's
it's not going to go on being this good, I can tell.
No, I just wonder if there's anything he obviously doesn't like anything about Britain. I just wonder if there's anything he likes about America. I failed to ever find anything that he has a favorable impression of.
I'm sorry for that. It may just be that I've been on television only when things have turned acidulous enough to invite me on. There's much to admire in both societies. What I've argued in my writing about it, I even wrote a book actually once about the special relationship, saying that I thought the Americans had been rather poisoned by an attachment to the English class system and empire. But I think what's been the problem is we've borrowed the wrong things from one another. For example, Peter just mentioned the parliamentary question time to which we subject our Prime Minister. I've always wished that would be the case for the President and the Senate and House. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln very nearly did start to agree to a question time, which C-SPAN has made more popular in this country during the Civil War. I wish that things about Britain like that were more admired, or the broadcasting standards of the BBC were more generally available here, or of the West End stage or of the National Health Service. And as to the United States, it seems to me I've made the best testimony I can by deciding to make it my home.
As you
to raise an American family.
As you travel about the city and the country and people learn that you're Christopher Hitchens' brother, what's the first thing they say to you?
They say, "Aren't you Christopher Hitchens' brother?" And I say, "No, he's my brother."
By the way, here's a fact from David in Los Angeles, actually Luxor Pictures. Do you think that in the near future before Armageddon that the U.S. should return to the British Commonwealth of Nations?
Well, I didn't know Armageddon was that close, but frankly, I wouldn't wish the British Commonwealth of Nations on anybody. As a body of dictatorships and failed nations, it's one of the most depressing international organizations I've ever stumbled across, and I would advise you to stay well clear of it.
Yeah, with any luck, South Africa will rejoin once it has its democratic election. I think it would be a great honor to have President Mandela join the British Commonwealth. As to the other matter, well, Cecil Rhodes, when he set up those famous scholarships, gave it as the objective of the scholarship program to recover the United States for the British Empire. So you might want to watch out at the number of Rhodes scholars who've been smuggled into senior positions by the Clinton administration. It's already double the number that President Kennedy employed.
From last Friday's show, which Michael Elliott, another Brit, was here, and we had Yorick Martin yesterday, and now you two, and last night was Bill Emmett. This is Brit's weekend here at C-SPAN. From last Friday's, this is from Kitty Crouch of Plattsburgh, Missouri. Friday's Journalist Roundtable. The disqualifier was an anonymous source. How is it different from Deep Throat, talking about the document shredding at the Rose Law Firm?
Well, I do prefer my sources not to be anonymous, especially if they're about things like that. Deep Throat was a source of continuous actual information which could be checked out. It's different from an anonymous tip-off that, which is its own and sole authority.
Do you agree with that, Peter Hitchens?
I don't know. I think there was something very peculiar about the response of the Rose Law Firm, which changed its statement on the alleged shredding 3 times. And I must say I've watched the work that Jerry Sieber has done in the Washington Times, and he's generally been ahead of the game. So I will reserve judgment on whether that anonymous source will turn out to be another Deep Throat or not.
Richfield, Minnesota, you're next.
Yes, I wanted to agree with one of the previous callers about how often that GOP conference was run this weekend. I was trying to watch C-SPAN. I finally quit listening because they, nasty, personal. And I disagree with Peter Hitchens that it's all right to call names. And I believe there's a plot going on out here in this country with the conservatives. Because every time the president comes up in the polls, they're out in the country digging up something. And it's just, I just can't believe it.
What impact do you think it has on the public at large? Are they going along with these things that are dug up, or are they rejecting them?
Well, I don't know. So far, it looks like they're rejecting it. And I certainly hope the American people are going to be able to see through this.
All right,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Peter Hitchens?
Yes, well, the problem of name calling is one that I addressed, that you really should get used to it. It doesn't do any harm. But the problem for conservatives in this country is that they're in danger of doing what Democrats did during Watergate, and imagining that they can ride to power simply on the basis of the failure, unpopularity, and sleaze of the regime which they attack. They'd be much better occupied, and I agree with you about this at least, in formulating a policy which would appeal to the American people and which would get them back into the White House, and which might conceivably remove the permanent Democratic majority from the constipated Congress which you suffer under.
This article by Lloyd Grove on the Conservative Conference over the weekend, he writes about Lisa Kennedy Montgomery, 21-year-old MTV video jock, eschewing college to start a career in radio, where she gained a following with heavy-breathing poetry, sexual sonnets, she calls them, about her love fantasy, Dan Quayle. Quote, "There is Dan with the piercing eyes so blue, so intoned by way of illustration." In 1992, she jumped, I'm not doing very well with the poetry reading. In 1992, she jumped to MTV, where she hosted 11:30 to 12:30 late night grunge show. Are you with this so far? Alternative Nation is what it's called. Conservative guys are babes, she argued, suit-wearing hunks. Anything you want to comment on so far?
Yeah, I was once the spectre of the feast at the NICPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee conference. I had to open as the sort of the banquet with Joe Sobran, and it seems to me that things have cheered up since the one I went to, which was as staid as could be, and was a row of suits.
Well, Lloyd Grove says on Saturday, Kennedy was seated at a place of honor at retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's table. When North breezed into the conference to address the young America's Foundation, a group of several hundred college kids, he looks like he watches MTV, Kennedy ventured, eyeing North. No, we don't get much TV, the Virginia Senate candidate clarified later, but we had a very nice conversation.
Sick.
What would you vote for Oliver North if you lived in Virginia and could vote?
No, I don't think so. But I don't have any really very strong passions about it. I don't find him as disturbing as some people do, because I don't think in the general run of politics he stands out as being particularly villainous.
Southfield, Michigan. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to mention also, although I wasn't going to, the viciousness of the conservative conference. I think it started with the merchant of meanness, otherwise known as Rush Limbaugh. By the way, I'm giving up orange juice. I would challenge the gentleman's comment that it doesn't do any harm, because we used to show a great deal of respect for the position of the presidency, if nothing else. I mean, it was apple pie Chevrolet, and the presidency automatically, by virtue of his having attained the position, deserves some respect. And that is, I think Rush became so rich, so quick, by breaking all the rules, doing it deliberately, saying, I don't have to respect and I won't. And aren't you people out there just ready to jump onto all these feminists, now known as feminazis? I think that word in and of itself is rather revealing, but that's not really what I call to say. With Mr. Jackson and Peter Brock and all of their charges, I think the reason they're going to be dismissed is because if they're connected with Brock and Jackson, they're automatically questioned. In fact, I watched a rerun about 5 minutes ago, and Jackson made the comment that Clinton was always obsessed with the presidency, and he questions the mental stability of anyone who is obsessed. And I swear if they ever put obsession in the Olympics, Jackson's got the gold with his attempts to have Clinton removed from the presidency. One story I'd like to ask somebody to look into would be when Ronald Reagan retired, number one, his $2 million payola from the Japanese, which is what I think cost General Motors half of its salaried workforce. But the other issue is the Reagans were given a home by the Friends of Reagan. It was in Santa Barbara, where the company that was given the Star Wars contract, and that was Hughes Aircraft and Delco Systems. Don Atwood was VP of General Motors before he became the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and it was right after that that they got the Star Wars contracts. And these Friends of Reagan, I'd like to know who they are.
All right, thanks. Mr. Hitchens.
Well, actually, the Friends of Reagan is something that begins before he's even governor. I mean, a group of fairly rich right-wing Californian businessmen, Holmes Tuttle, Justin Dart, a few others, decided that they would pay Reagan's bills and use him as their sort of smiling front man from then on. And I'm sure the practice continued and cushioned his retirement. And as always with these things, there's nothing illegal about it, and the scandal is what is taken for granted. The only thing I know about his home in Santa Barbara that you didn't mention is that when he and his wife moved into it, they found that the street number was 666, which, as everyone knows, is the mark of the beast. And because they're both very primitive and superstitious and astrology-guided and, in other ways, cretinous, they changed it to 665 and a half. And I think that's far worse than all the payola put together.
Let's go to Torrance, California next. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning, gentlemen. First of all, let me please describe myself as a raging moderate. I'm by no means conservative.
Moderation or death?
I want to read a very short passage from a text on abnormal psychology. And please understand, I'm certainly not asking you for a clinical diagnosis here. But
That's
I
a
want
relief.
you to keep in mind whether or not what you think I'm reading might relate to the issue of trust that the American people seem to have with our president. The first characteristic is inadequate conscience development and lack of anxiety and guilt. Antisocial personalities are unable to understand and accept ethical values except on a verbal level. They make glib verbalizations and claims of adherence to high standards of morality that have no apparent connection with their behavior because it is marked discrepancy between their level of intelligence and their level of conscience development, they have been referred to as moral morons.
Peter Hitchens.
What can I say? Are you casting aspersions on the President of the United States? I think I'd probably be most unwise of me, given the comments of some earlier callers on political abuse, to agree with you that this applies to any major political figure of our day.
There's a ton of facts coming in. Have just finished for the sake of argument. It is your book. It is motivating, thoughtful, exposing, a must for all. Thank you, Mr. Hitchens.
So that fax got through. I was wondering if it would.
Yeah, it did get through from, I think it's Evelyn Keyes. There's another one here, though. Why does Vanity Fair have a cover with the Trumps preaching family values when they're adulterers and had a bastard child? Then inside you blast Oliver North as poor stock for a senator, yet he was cleared of all charges and, as far as we know, an upstanding family man. That's Penny Clark of Alexandria.
Very good. Nothing on the first point. I think the title of Klein's piece saying Trump family values is supposed to be slightly humorous. It's a common fallacy to say that Oliver North was cleared. He wasn't cleared of any charges. The charges were set aside on a technicality, but they were not overturned on the grounds that the convictions arose from North's own testimony, which had been immunized before Congress. If he says he was cleared of the charges, what he's saying is that everything he said to Congress was a lie, which, since he said it under oath, would convict him outright of perjury then and there. Don't let people get away with telling you that about North, by the way. It's simply not true. It is true that the courts are sometimes soft on crime and people get off on technicalities, and I'm a staunch conservative in saying that I think that's a bad thing. That's it, really.
This woman sent two in. We don't normally do this quickly, but she says, 2 thoughts on Rush and Citrus Commission, vodka and OJ, hold the OJ. A day with Rush is a day without sunshine. I would like to give Christopher Hitchens an opportunity to remind people of today's dreadful anniversary, that is Salman Rushdie.
I had tied a knot in my own handkerchief about this. Thank you for whoever that was. It's 5 years ago today, Valentine's Day, that from Tehran came the edict, or UK's, or fatwa as it's known, to Shia Muslims, whereby the Ayatollah Khomeini, presumed moribund fanatic that he was, to sentence a friend of mine and a great author to death. And since then, Salman has been living under what is both a death and a life sentence. If you go to your bookshop today, thanks to Don DeLillo and various other generous authors, International Pen is putting a leaflet in many, many millions of book bags, reminding people. It's a beautifully written reminder of what's happening. I would suggest everyone goes and rewards an American bookshop today and orders a copy of the paperback of the Satanic Verses and tells the Ayatollah and his heirs, inheritors, and assigns where to put their fatwa.
Hopewell, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to make a quick comment to Christopher Hitchens, or Hutchinson, who talked about Oliver North. I am planning to be a delegate for Oliver North at the Republican Convention.
Sorry to hear it.
And the main reason we're going to elect Oliver North from Virginia is just to make the rest of the country mad. We are sick of New York, California, New Jersey, the Northeast, Washington, D.C., and the rest of the liberal country. And we're going to send a message. We're not going to put up with it too much longer before we leave. We left once, we'll do it again. We're not going to do it too much longer.
All right,
I hope there are lots more like you, and I hope that everyone listened to that.
Peter Hitchens, any reaction to that caller?
I did think that the Civil War was over, and I didn't realize the issue was that potent. But I'd prefer to stay out of it.
This is the sort of stuff under the rocks that North brings out. And I mean, I thought that was very eloquent.
When you two disagree, what's the #1 thing you'll disagree on politically?
Well, it used to be the Soviet Union. And sad to say, I always remember Christopher saying, I think he denies it now, that he didn't care if the Red Army watered its horses in Hendon, which is a not particularly agreeable suburb of London. And also telling me that the Soviet Constitution of 1936 was a document of great moral force. And I used to mock him for this, and indeed I still do. Now that the Soviet Union is gone, I suppose we could disagree slightly about Salman Rushdie, not just about the quality of his books, but about the wonderful paradox, again, of this man who spent many years modishly sneering against the British Conservative government and then found that when he was in deep trouble and danger, they were the ones who could be relied upon to protect him from those who wished to assassinate him, whereas the left in Britain, and particularly the British Labour Party, deserted him and left him swinging in the wind.
How long are you going to be here in the States?
Well, I'm here on a 2-year assignment. I'd like to be here longer, but 2 years is what the paper says, and that's what I think it'll probably work out as. But with newspapers, you never know, it could even be less.
feel I should clear my name on the Red Army watering the horses. It's certainly true that I used to quarrel with Peter a lot about it. I regard and regarded the United States as at least morally a co-founder of the Cold War and and more than a co-founder of the arms race. I didn't think of it as a battle between democracy and evil empire, and I don't, in retrospect, think so either. On Salman, I don't think there's any irony involved in the fact that a government that he didn't much care for took on the responsibility of protecting him. He just has the same right as any other British citizen to be guaranteed against the depredations of blackmailers and people who openly offer money for the procurement of assassination.
Orlando, go ahead, please.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day.
Thanks, same to you.
I got a couple of questions before I get to it. I just want to say I get a kick out of these people who call up about the nasty conservatives. Remember, there's James Carville and George Stephanopoulos, but the Democrats will have their turn in C-SPAN. And the woman that called about the feminists being feminazis, these people really just don't listen to Rush. There's only about 25 feminazis, according to Rush, and that'll listen to him for about a month. My first question is, I want to know what's the difference between Bob Packwood, what he did about 20 years ago, and Clinton and what he's done in the last 12 to 13 years. And I think when Clinton talks about the last 12 years, he must be talking about Jennifer Flowers, it must be a Freudian slip, and Sally Perdue, and recently Paula Jones. And I think character is so important, and I try to teach my sons that integrity and honesty is very important. I think it's very sexy, and remember, what goes around comes around. And do you think more papers other than the New York Post and the Washington Times will pick up on Vince Foster and all the oddities of his death?
Mr. Hitchens. They said, which
yes.
one?
Look, I think that, if you think back on it, John Tower didn't make it to be Secretary of Defense. I think it was absolutely ridiculous to even consider him as Secretary of Defense, but not because he was a boozer and a bit of a groper. In fact, those were the only two good things I knew about him. But those were the only grounds on which he could have his nomination arrested or held up. Same with Clarence Thomas, same with Packwood, same with innumerable others. The question with these peccadillos is, do they connect to anything else? Is it anything more general than human frailty? In other words, as with, say, John F. Kennedy, whose promiscuity was an aspect of his bad politics. I mean, he was sleeping with a gun mole who was a mafia girlfriend at the same time that he was using mafia as a state instrument of policy in Cuba. Thus, the peccadillo connects to the big sin and becomes important to investigate. The question with Clinton is, as I tried to say before, is his sexual style, so to speak, related to the way that he ran Arkansas with his wife as a bit of a racket, a sort of revolving door of special interests and campaign donors and favors, and has he brought that style to Washington? I think that's a very good question. I've tried to ask it in The Nation, and I've found that the Wall Street Journal's questions on this have been very pertinent, and some of the ones in the American Spectator also.
Peter Hitchens?
And I'd like to move on from that to the question of Vincent Foster and his very peculiar death, which you mentioned, and I do hope that, as you suggested, other people do take it up. The more I look at it, the more bizarre it seems. And I've been trying, for instance, under the Freedom of Information Act, to get documents on his death for some months, and they have been denied. All kinds of things which should have taken place in this death haven't. And I very much hope that the major press takes it up and it becomes the issue which it ought to be.
Sonoma, California.
Hi, good morning. Good morning to you English chaps. I originally called, I wanted to mention something about the Russian Chernobyl thing, but since a couple of callers I was waiting, I just want to make a few comments on that. It'll be painless, I'm sure.
We'll be the judge of that.
I guess you will, but Christopher, I called to give you a little pat on the back. I've been watching you for a while, and you seem like you got a good head on your shoulders, like the other guy said and all that. And, you seem like a real credit to the journalistic people. I didn't know you had a brother. I'm glad to see that. You're turning out to be a double threat. That's real good. And Brian, of course, excellent show. But on the Chernobyl thing, they have 180 tons of plutonium just, contaminating the Earth. And now we know that there's a submarine leaking in the North Atlantic, and now we've just been told there's a submarine leaking in the Middle Atlantic. And I'm under the impression that 1 gram of plutonium can pollute the entire ocean. So, I think you guys should do a little bit more stuff on this.
Thanks.
Well, it's just an illustration, again, of how the Soviet Union was an evil empire. The incompetence and sloppiness and sloth of the people in charge of Chernobyl, and the risks taken by the people who drove the Soviet Navy's nuclear program were incredible, and the world is littered with the results of what they did without any serious supervision at all, and you're going to be finding more of it. And if you think that the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were morally equivalent, you'll find in the conduct of their nuclear program clear evidence that this was not so.
Simulcast of Jerry Brown Tuesday night, 7 to 9 East Coast. Rush Limbaugh Friday, 12 to 3 East Coast time. Ardsley, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have two comments. The first comment is regarding Cliff Jackson. I think he has an unhealthy obsession with getting the president. I don't know if the FBI is looking in, but I would certainly look into this man, because I think it is so unhealthy that he would be capable of killing the president. That's my first comment, and I'm very serious about that. I think it's a completely unhealthy obsession. And the second comment I have, Christopher, I just love your writings, and I look forward to getting my Vanity Fair every month. I want to say, if you would kindly fantasize a little bit and go up to 1996, and it's the day after the presidential election, and President Clinton has won re-election. Can you fantasize for us and tell us why the Republicans lost it?
Thanks.
I wouldn't have to fantasize. I mean, I'd love invitations to fantasize, naturally, but I wouldn't have to fantasize very much, or free associate very much, to come up with the answer to that. The Republicans would have lost because they would have been defeated by a moderate Republican president, because that's what I believe the Clinton-Gore presidency to be. He's attempting, I mean, to shift the center of gravity towards something like a grand coalition of, you know, Liberal, Republican, and Conservative Democrat. And I think there is a mass constituency for that sort of politics in this country, and that's why he's forgiven so much in the polls for what has been so far a not very exciting presidency.
Phil Huff of Dillon, Colorado. Roses are red, violets are blue. Peter and Chris are cleverness imbued. But what of British health care? At first there was despair, and now it seems pretty fair. Should everyone in America be covered? Let's go to Gonzales, Louisiana next. We may get to that if we have time. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, look, I want to comment on the politically correct group here. You know, they're always the liberals who are always, look like they're always voicing their opinion that if you don't agree with me, you know, well, then you're wrong. And, you know, I like Rush Limbaugh. I think he kind of opens up, you know, what he has to say. He's not down the liberals. He's only showing where they always think they're right. And as far as cutting down presidents, they never, when Ronald Reagan first got in there, it was like, you know, Reaganomics, voodoo Reaganomics. And they never gave the man a chance, and the same thing with George Bush. There's a double standard here. I believe that the liberal press, I think it's poor journalism nowadays, very poor journalism, because, number one, it's a one-sided thing.
Thanks. Peter, Hitchens?
Well, let that go as a comment, if I were you.
Well, just on political correctness, the one I enjoyed most was the Los Angeles Times style book for journalists, which urged them that in future they should not use the word normal, presumably because there is nothing normal in Los Angeles anymore.
From Orlando, Florida, Helen Park faxes, how much money could the British Treasury save if the royal family was no longer subsidized by British taxpayers, and would the savings offset the losses in tourist revenue?
Probably not. Is the answer to the second question.
You know how much
it's very difficult to find out how much the royal family costs, if anything, because the royal family owns so much of the country in the strict sense of real estate, as well as a lot of property. That it's, and so much of that is very closely held. The Crown Estate's a very secretive body, not really subject to parliamentary scrutiny. But those of us who are Republicans, by which I mean, I think only myself, I don't think I speak for my brother in this, don't think of it as an actuarial or financial question. I mean, I would be very glad if there was less tourism.
You like the monarchy?
I think the monarchy is essential, and I think it's far cheaper than the new Air Force One, which you've just spent so many millions of dollars on building, and the question of money isn't really important. The monarchy pays tax. The Queen goes around Buckingham Palace turning out the lights to save money.
Sun City, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
I'll turn them out for her if she asks.
Sun City, you're on the line. Go ahead, please. Nope, I got the wrong one. Hold on here. Let's see if we can get it. Did I miss? I did. Let's go to Washington, D.C. Go ahead, please.
Hello. It's a delight to get through for the very first time.
Welcome.
And I love your guests. They ought to do a regular Hitchens and Hitchens program on C-SPAN or CNBC.
Don't say it twice.
A couple of callers have talked about the whole question of Cliff Jackson and his pursuit of Bill Clinton. Wow. I think the motivation comes for a number of us who really see him as an illegitimate president. And I don't think you have to be paranoid or anxious to get someone to get to an issue of justice. I think the way in which the administration has withheld information from the public, first about who was on Hillary's health care task force, then about the Travelgate, then about Vince Foster's suicide, it's enough to make you think that they're not obeying the rules that all the rest of Washington is compelled to live by.
Thanks.
Boy, Cliff Jackson seems to have really touched a nerve, doesn't he?
Well, he was on the panel this weekend.
Yeah, no, I understand, I realise, but and there is something very extraordinary about very driven about the guy. But I mean, look, I was at Oxford at the same time as these guys. I didn't know either of them. But suppose I had known someone very well and thought of him as a very poor character and then watched him inexorably rise to be the president. I think I might go around saying, look, I insist on telling you something about this guy that you may not know. It might well become your cause. I don't think Mr. Jackson's done it very elegantly, I'm bound to say. But to the meat of your point, it seems to me, just as an observer of this, that there has to be something to hide for people to behave so evasively. I mean, these are people who are absolutely masterly at public relations. In fact, it's really their chief skill, and particularly good at getting the line of the day straight and getting everyone saying the same thing in sync. When that breaks down, as it's been doing, you have to realize, you're entitled to make the presumption that there's something they don't want you to know, and that's the presumption I'm operating on now.
Malcolm Pierce of Durham, Connecticut. Dear distinguished British cousins, the American print and television press keep telling us how smart the Clintons are, yet being smart and having good judgment aren't necessarily one and the same. How do liberal and conservative brothers from across the pond size up the American first family after a year in office? What kind of a grade would you give him?
I think they've done rather disturbingly well, because what they're very good at is running a campaign, and what the Clinton presidency is the 1996 campaign rather than the first Clinton presidency.
What would you say?
I hate to agree, but I think that's about right. I mean, I say it again. I think it is the extension of the Bush-Quayle regime.
Los Angeles, you're next.
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly say to questions for Peter, but I would just like to say to Christopher Hitchens that it's true there isn't a lot of expression of his point of view in the media, and it's too bad, because I think more people would vote if there was more of an expression of his point of view, because I think the fact people don't vote is partly a reaction that there isn't diversity. But the question to Peter Hitchens is that he was talking about the Cold War and the fact that the Soviet Union was an evil empire because of their nuclear problems. I would just like to point out that America tested radiation on its own population and conducted numerous atrocities with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. I think to look at one side in the Cold War and call one side an evil empire is a little naive.
Well, I have to disagree with you there. I spent 2.5 years in the Soviet Union, and among the places I visited was the area in Kazakhstan where the Soviet Union conducted its nuclear tests. Not just the occasional individual injected with a little bit of plutonium, but entire villages exposed without their knowledge to plutonium by an immensely cynical regime. Political prisoners put on construction detail on radioactive sites. The whole system so different from America, so difficult for you to comprehend that you might think they were equivalent. It is a difference in quality so deep that it's almost impossible to express, and it's certainly impossible to compare the two.
I think it's pretty easy to comprehend, though, because even if you didn't know this about the Soviet Union, because I regard it as proof that the inhabitants of the Marshall Islands were used as guinea pigs for American nuclear tests, and British ones too in the Pacific. The French certainly used the Polynesians as experimental subjects, and more than that, the inhabitants of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were subjected to an experiment in atomic testing. When it's now been absolutely conclusively demonstrated that the motive for that was not to shorten the war. All the Truman Papers are out now. Everybody knows that cover story was for the birds. It was an attempt to see if the damn thing worked and to frighten the Russians and to use the Japanese as guinea pigs.
On any given day, what's the first newspaper you'll pick up and read?
Actually, the Washington Times, because it has an opposition stance to the government in Washington, which I enjoy, and which is much more like a morning with the British papers, where you start with a mass of criticism of the government and embarrassing scandals.
Mr. Hitchens?
I find it so difficult to give my dime to the coffers of the Reverend Moon, but I do read the Washington Times, but I don't start with
What's
it.
your first read?
I start with the New York Times. Alas, lack a day, but I have to.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
This question is for Christopher, please. I'd like to know if he would ever try to interview Ramona Africa, since May 15th is coming up, and a move in Philadelphia was similar to the Waco situation. And number two is, how does he feel that the South African thing is going to play out with the Zulu and the right conservative with the Mandela thing? Thank you very much, and have a safe day.
Thank you. Well, there is a wonderful book by a man I greatly admire, an African-American writer called John Edgar Wideman, called Philadelphia Fire, about the extraordinary events in Philadelphia and the bombing out of the MOVE commune. It hadn't occurred to me to go and observe the anniversary, but I mean, now you mention it, it might also be very interesting. I'll give it my best thought. I love Philadelphia anyway, every excuse to go there. As to South Africa, I've always been an optimist. When you think of what might have happened if it wasn't for the existence of the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, of the race war into which the country would long since have been plunged, it would have been far worse than the Congo. And when you think of how narrowly they've escaped that fate and embarked on the alternative, it's impossible not to be really somewhat uplifted. I look forward to the ANC winning a clear majority, which I think it would have done even if the extreme right and the Zulu tribalists had not backed out. And I look forward to the great moment when Nelson Mandela will cast his first vote, the first vote of his life, and in that same election will become president. I think that's a wonderful outcome.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's amazing to hear you say that they've avoided a race war. The fact is there is, at present, a race war taking place in South Africa. And the coverage, which was enormous during the last years of the apartheid regime, has fallen away. And if you actually saw now what was going on, the amount of racial killing between Xhosa and Zulu, you would be horrified. And that may well prefigure a far worse civil war once the ANC is in
It's still
power.
a lot better than it was going to be, or than it could have been. And it's the
Not necessarily.
ANC will be able to control it.
Fort Myers, Florida, last call for our Hitchens brothers. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to bring up Bill Clinton's mentor and professor at Georgetown University, who Mr. Clinton mentioned at the acceptance speech at the Democratic nomination. In the speech, he said, as a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship, and then as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley. Now, Carroll Quigley wrote a book in 1966, 1,300 pages, published by the Macmillan Company, and throughout the book, he refers to the Council on Foreign Relations. He refers to it as a secret and semi-secret group. And everybody in almost everybody in Bill Clinton's administration is a member of the CFR.
All right, thanks.
I think this is someone who worries about the Trilateral Commission a lot. It's a pity we have to end on it.
There's a fax here from Cleo Rosebud Zoots of Rainbow, California. Who do I bill for the loss of a $15 birthday dinner, C-SPAN or the American Conservative Union? Switching channels from ads during the Olympic opening ceremony, beauty, art, music, honor, a plea to stop the killing in Bosnia. I happened upon C-SPAN and David Kroc of the American Spittoon. The exposure to his right-wing invective caused oral emesis. Is that right? That's right. You're a linguist.
Emesis, yes, emetic, yeah.
And required large doses of DGH free milk and ginger snaps. I associate Christopher Hitchens, one of, if not the most brilliant thinkers, social analysts, writers in the U.S., with The Nation, a magazine published since 1865. They're ticked off that over the weekend we associated you with Vanity Fair instead of The Nation. All week, C-SPAN has announced his appearance on Events in the News, stating that he is with Vanity Fair, a paean to consumerism, political gossip, and quasi-tabloid reportage. Why? Please ask him to comment. That's it. That's the last facts for you, sir.
Of course, I can only look like a toady if I say how wonderful my employers are, but as it happens, I think Vanity Fair is a very serious magazine. If you buy the current number, A, the piece on the Trops is very interesting. B, there's a brilliant article on the Menendez trial and the implications for justice of that trial in California. There's a great piece by me on Oliver North. There's a fantastically interesting interview by my friend Andy Bardat with Fidel Castro, first one he's given to an American reporter for a long time. This is not the glitz that people take it for, and it's very cleverly and carefully edited, fact-checked, lawyered. It's a pleasure to be edited at the magazine. Believe me, I would say this if they weren't paying me.
Your parents, was there a conservative and a liberal in the Hitchens home?
I wouldn't say so, no.
No, it was... Papa was very conservative indeed, and Mama a little more compassionate, I think the word would probably be, perhaps.
Where do you think your brother Christopher, your older brother Christopher, got his views?
I've often wondered. I genuinely don't know.
It's not in the genes, at any rate.
You can get
you have to educate yourself out of genes like that, believe me.
You can get the International Express now by writing, I guess it's Speedompex or something like that, 3502 48th Avenue, Long Island City, New York. For $130 a year, you can get International Express every week.
Worth every cent.
University of York graduate Peter Hitchens. Been in this country for the last 6 months representing the London Daily Express as Washington correspondent. Has been with the paper for 17 years. Prior to coming to the United States was in Moscow. Originally was born in Malta and grew up with his brother 2 years older than him, Christopher Hitchens, columnist for Vanity Fair and The Nation. And he's been with The Nation since 1978. Is a graduate of Oxford, originally from Portsmouth, Hampshire, England. And we thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Maybe we'll do this again sometime if you have time. And thanks to our audience. Have a good week.